Welcome back to the channel. Today is exciting because we're going to actually talk about wiring up that LS swap. So I wanted to cover a few different things. First, I'm pretty excited to share with you a poll that I recently did in one of the Facebook groups. So I wanted to share that poll results, which was basically, hey, what harness are you using? And so I had that polled, and I think around 115, 120 or so responded. Also, I wanted to talk about the different categories of harness. So I want to talk about what the differences are in terms of how I see that and the level of complexity as you're going through your swap. Finally, I wanted to talk about the inputs and outputs, some of the major things that you'll need to do. And this really applies to just about every harness. So with that, let's get to it. All right, so the first, number one, of all the harnesses was used by 47 out of about 120 guys. Highly terminated. Honestly, if I were to do mine all over again, this is the one I would use. The second one was about 30 guys modified from donor car or truck. Okay. The next one was 11 guys used PCI conversion. I'll give you sort of the last few here. 2 did the Phytech Ultimate. 2 did the Current Performance, which is another great company. And actually, I think they're a Florida-based company where I'm at. And then the other 3 had 1 vote each. Speed Ueno, Holly Dominator, Hawks, Jolt, EFI Connection, and Spear Tech. Those each got 1 vote. So that kind of rounds up the results. Big winner, no surprise. These guys are doing it right. It's a very nice self-learning system. You don't need HP tuners, which is very complicated, which is kind of what you need on most of these. For example, mine, if I were to go in and tune it, I gotta spend another $300 to $400 on HP tuner software. Holly Terminator comes with everything you need. It's just a great system. This is the one I would recommend this is the one that I would do again if I were to do it over and purchased a harness. And for me, if you're looking for cost effectiveness, this is the most economical, right? So modified from your existing car, especially if you already have the donor car. This is just time, right? So instead of spending, $600 to $1,000 on, or $600 to over $1,000 on pre-made harnesses, you can kind of make your own here. And so the pocket one is the other one I'll talk about in a minute. So that's the result, guys. Hope that's helpful when you're out there making your wiring decision. I'll go over some other aspects of this here in a second. All right, guys, let's talk about some required connections. So you get your harness, and we'll talk about the different categories in a minute. But what are the required connections? And this pretty much applies across the board. So first of all, you're gonna have sensors, right, for the typical LS. So I'm just gonna sort of write them down real quick. So you're gonna have things like coolant sensor. Now the coolant sensor, typically what you wanna do is use, you'll need to buy a LS1 coolant sensor instead of probably the one that came with yours. Normally they come with a 2-pin setup for a coolant sensor. that goes to your ECM, you want a 3-pin. So that green wire that normally comes on that 3-pin goes directly to your gauge, right? And so that goes to your coolant temperature gauge. So normally these come with a 2-pin. You want to change that over to a 3-pin, and then that extra pin goes right to your gauge. Obviously you need a MAF. Maybe you're running speed density or something like that. I'm just going to talk about the things I know about. I don't really know that much about speed density, so maybe you guys could comment below how that's different. Some are a big believer in that. So obviously you have your MAF, and that's typically in the intake tube. Now the thing I'll mention about that is typically the requirements when you're, especially because our vehicles, you'll need to custom make that intake tube typically, or if you buy something that's pretty close, the requirements around that about where you put that boss, that MAF boss in that tubing, is you want a minimum of 6 inches straight section that it's in. So you don't want any curved sections that's really near the MAF. The other thing is you want a minimum of 10 inches from the throttle body. Hopefully you can read this pretty good. I don't have the best writing, but we'll get through it. And there's a orientation, and you'll see it most on the MAFs. And I'm talking, you know, especially on the LS3 here, and I think that also includes the IAT on the Gen 4 stuff. But you'll see an arrow. So those are 3 things you need to think about in terms of the MAF. Okay, now you have just other random things that are basically just hook it up. Things like cam, position sensor, oxygen sensors. There's normally 2 of those. NOx sensors. Now I think the difference there is a Gen 3 is going to have the NOx sensors on top, and the Gen 4 has a NOx sensor on each side of the lower end of the block. So ignition coil blocks, that's kind of like where your coils are going to snap into. There's 2 of those, and then you have an ignition coil that snaps into those, and obviously there's 4 coil connections per block. Okay. Obviously fuel injectors, connectors, you'll have to do that. There's 8 of those, obviously. Crank position sensor, pretty straightforward. So I would say those are like the typical sensor sort of connections. Now I want to talk about next a different category of things you need to wire up as inputs in order for this system to work. So let's take a look at that next. All right, now this is in general again. Now we talked about there's a lot of different harnesses in there, but I will say that every single one of them require at least these things. Number 1, you're going to need to wire up an ignition on 12-volt circuit. Now you can wire that from your, you can wire it from straight from your fuse box. There's ignition on circuit there. And honestly, what I did is where your old ECM was, there's a ECM power that runs to the passenger side dash. So it's those connectors that are left once you remove your old harness that runs through the kick panel and your ECM. There's a couple connectors that you just leave there. Leave those, because those are some things you can tap into to get this new, and typically that's where you're going to mount your new ECM, is where your stock ECM was anyway. So you have a lot of the inputs that I'm going to talk about here as part of that. So that's pretty straightforward, right? The other one is a fuel pump control. Now this is important. This just can't be, you can't just wire your key on. ignition power to your existing third gen fuel pump circuit that I think is the gray wire that runs down the side of the car, and it goes essentially through the hump of the car where the back seat is. This circuit you're going to need to put on your ECM. So your ECM, this is an output coming in. So most of your harness that you purchase is going to have an output that controls your fuel pump control. And just like, for example, on your TPI, when you turn your key on, you hear the fuel pump run for a few seconds. That's why this fuel pump control is important, because it manages that, right? If you just hooked it onto a key on source, when you turn on the key, it would just keep basically running and running and running and not turn off. So that's important, but it's pretty easy. Just wire this to your existing fuel pump circuit. Next one is, obviously engine grounds. And I will say that you should have some behind the heads. I ran one from the chassis to the block. So be liberal with the engine grounds. So this is just power straight from the battery to constant power, pretty easy. Cooling fan. Now, this is the one that comes from the ECM. Some of them have a low and a high. Some of them are merged into one. And then finally you have, like in my case, and I have a T56, so I'm just talking manual here. There's a whole nother automatic piece that probably is worth another video here. But reverse low speed lockout, and that's just it knows based on your VSS, your vehicle speed sensor, anything under 5 miles per hour or 15 miles an hour, it engages a solenoid, so you can put your car in reverse super easy. And so you don't put it in reverse when you're shifting gears. Nobody's ever done that, but hey, safety is what it is. Okay, so that is the required inputs. And just about every single system out there is going to have something very similar, okay? Now, let's talk about the fun stuff, the optional stuff, but is it really optional? I don't know. I would say no. These are the things that you need to get information, and mainly for your gauge cluster for the interior, okay? So on the LS3 controller kit by the GM Performance Parts, I'll reference that. I would say that most of these do have similar circuits. You'll need an alternator. In my case, it was a one wire, and that's basically your excite wire. And of course you have your large battery cable that runs to it, but from the ECM, you only have one wire connector here. And that's really the ECM that basically tells the alternator to charge, okay? So that's a connector that I actually cut off the original one and put the one wire excite on for the F-body alternator. Now here's an interesting engine oil pressure. This one is, now on my harness, I actually had I believe it was a 2-wire sensor connector that ran in the back behind the intake manifold. And that one was, I had to replace that because there's no way to get the oil pressure to the gauge in that case. Okay, so what I did is I used an LS1 version of that, which is a single wire. It's a sender single wire, and that goes to the gauge. Okay, so what's bad about that, not really bad, but you have to know that now the ECM really doesn't know the oil pressure. Now, some guys, they do some crazy fancy stuff where they'll actually run a splitter and run both senders, right? So you have one sender that's basically going to the ECM and one sender for your for your gauge. So if you guys know another way of doing that, it'd be interesting to know what you did on that. Please leave a comment below. Okay, now you got things like vehicle speed sensor. That's an output from the ECM based on your transmission. How fast your transmission is running, basically your speed. Output that goes to your speedo gauge. Now my 85 is a little difficult. You need a cable VSS converter box, and they're about, I don't know, 300 bucks or so. They're pretty expensive. So just know that. I think the later models, you guys are probably okay with that. But mine, I need a, because you don't have the cable on the later models. Okay, the other one is the mill or the cell, right? And basically that is your check engine light, right? Or your malfunction indicator light, I think was what they reference it in the mill. But essentially that's your engine light, okay? Wire that, there's an output typically for that. Wire that straight into your dash light, works very nicely. So you got that. Then you also, obviously you have your tack. Now I use a Dakota Digital. One thing about the tack is you will need a lot of times the guys use a resistor pull-up mod, if you will. So let's say you have this coming from your ECM. This is your tack out. They would basically also run a 12-volt circuit here with a 1K ohm resistor, and they tie that together. That basically pulls up. It doesn't give it the full 12 volts, but it's something about translating a square wave to a smooth wave, or I'm not going to act like I'm an electrical engineer here, but I just know you need to put a 1K ohm resistor in that to pull it up. And then, so if you wire your tack out straight to your gauge from your harness and your gauge doesn't even move, this is probably the mod you'll do. Now, I will tell you, one thing that I did was I actually ran a Dakota Digital tachometer speed control, and that has some great cool stuff because it actually has a 12-volt input, a ground. So I believe that eliminates this whole sort of mod. And so that makes it super nice, and it's totally adjustable. It's about 80 bucks, so I think it's worth it. So I would suggest getting that. All right, guys, a couple more areas I wanted to quickly cover. The different types of harnesses. So I kind of put these in different categories. One is off-the-shelf sort of harness that's pre-made, it's ready to go, it has all the sensors, it has directions, inputs, and the outputs. It's pretty much plug and play, and so you'll typically spend $600 on up to $1,200-1,300 bucks. Okay, those I consider the PSI conversion, the LS3 controller kit by the GM Performance Parts, the Holley setup as well, the Holley Terminator. All those things come, ready to go. So that's one category I put those harnesses in. The next category is make your own or custom, right? So whether that's pull it from your existing donor car, whether it's a car, your LS1 GTO or F-body, or your 4th gen, or a truck, whatever your car came out of, you can take that harness, strip it down, right? And there's a great guide by, I think, Pocket on TGO, thirdgen.org, for the Camaros and Firebirds. And again, I'll put that link in the description. With some time and a little bit of knowledge, you can do that pretty simple. So that's on the more budget-minded sort of setup. And then I'll put one more harness that I feel like is really in a league of its own in terms of it's a true standalone harness. Now you hear the term standalone used a lot. This one really is standalone, and that's the Pocket, quote unquote, Pocket harness, John Glasscock his harness. Again, if you contact him on thirdgen.org, he can make you a custom harness, and he essentially asks you some questions and builds it exactly to what you need. Now, what's different about his, he actually wires it into the C100. So some of those things that I was talking about the outputs going to your speedometer, a lot of those things run through that C100. And if you don't know what that is the plug, like on the left side of the firewall, right? That it's basically that big harness plug that's under your dash that everything from the engine runs through. Okay, you keep that as part of your swap. So that he actually has one that connects, and that way it's already wiring all the output things like the check engine light, the tach output, the vehicle speed, all those things is pretty much done. So those are the three categories. Now, finally, the thing that I wanted to talk about is, what do you do with your existing harness? How do you get that out of the car? A lot of guys ask, there's engine harness and there is chassis harness, right? There's a lot of different harnesses in the car. So here's a quick tip. Start underneath your dash, under the passenger side dash. Unhook your current, whether it's TPI or TBI, whatever it is. Unhook your existing ECM. Leave the connectors that run to the other side of the car, basically to the fuse block and that sort of thing. The other side, those connectors that run through the kick panel, what that does is it runs through the kick panel. There's a little rubber grommet there, and it runs up through the fender, and then so if you essentially follow that and start removing it from those connectors through the kick panel and just keep following it all the way into the engine bay. Everything that's connected to that you can easily unhook, remove it, and that's essentially what you do. When I remove mine, and here's a picture of what mine looked like. I hope that this at least gives you an idea of kind of like what to consider when you're buying a harness or building your own. There's a lot of information out there. I encourage you to research it. Knowledge is power, and I hope this is helpful. And as always, if this was helpful, please like, subscribe, and leave some comments on your experience.